You think those old Western movies got it right? Cowboys bellying up to the bar for nothing but whiskey and cards? Not even close. Wild West saloons were feeding operations as much as they were drinking establishments. And the food they served tells a story Hollywood never quite captured. From organ meat stews that used every part of the animal to desserts soaked in frontier whiskey, these weren't just meals. They were survival, tradition, and sometimes pure desperation served on tin plates. We're talking about 25 authentic cowboy foods that actually kept the American frontier alive. Dishes that fed gunslingers, cattle drivers, miners, and outlaws across the untamed West. Some will surprise you. Some might turn your stomach. And a few, well, they might just make you wish saloons like that still existed. Son of a gun stew. The name alone told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't food for the squeamish. Son of a gun stew was what happened when cowboys butchered a steer on the trail and decided nothing, absolutely nothing, would go to waste. We're talking organs most people today wouldn't recognize, let alone eat. Tried from the stomach lining, heart muscle, liver, marrow gut, sweetbreads from the thymus gland, and sometimes even brains, all tossed into a bubbling pot with whatever vegetables could be scrounged up. Saloons in cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene served it thick and peppery, often in cast iron pots that simmered all day on wood stoves. The broth was rich from the organ fats, darkened with onions, and sometimes thickened with flour or crushed hardtack. Cowboys knew the rule. You didn't ask what was in it, you just ate. Because on the frontier, questioning a hot meal was a luxury nobody could afford. What made it a saloon regular wasn't just the low cost, though that mattered when you were feeding broke drovers after a 3-month cattle drive. It was the calories. Organ meats are dense with nutrients, and a single bowl could keep a man working from sunup to sundown. Some saloons even made it a test of manhood. If you could finish a full serving without flinching, you earned respect. If you couldn't, well, there was always the beans. Sourdough Flapjacks. Long before diners served fluffy buttermilk pancakes, cowboys were eating sourdough flapjacks, dense, tangy, chewy rounds of fermented batter fried in bacon grease until the edges crisped like lace. The sourdough starter was sacred on the frontier. Cooks carried it in sealed tins or crocks, sometimes tucked into saddlebags or wrapped in bedrolls to keep it from freezing overnight. That starter could be weeks old, months old, even years old, passed down from one cook to the next like an heirloom. Making flapjacks was simple. Mix the starter with flour, water, and a pinch of salt. No sugar, no eggs, no milk unless you were near a dairy ranch. Then you fried them in whatever fat was handy, usually pork drippings or beef tallow. The result was substantial. These weren't breakfast cakes that melted in your mouth. They landed in your stomach like stones, which is exactly why some called them sinkers. But they stuck with you, and that's what mattered when you had a long ride ahead and no guarantee of another meal. Saloons served the morning, noon, or midnight, depending on who wandered in. If you were lucky, there'd be molasses to drizzle on top, or maybe some canned peaches if the saloon owner had connections to the railroad. But most of the time, it was just flapjacks, hot and plain, stacked on a tin plate. The sour tang from the fermentation cut through the richness of the grease, and that last flapjack on the stack, that one always got the extra attention, because even in the Wild West, some traditions were universal. Rabbit stew. When beef prices climbed or cattle were driven to distant markets, cowboys and saloon cooks turned to what they could hunt, and rabbits were everywhere. Quick, plentiful, and easier to catch than deer or buffalo, rabbits became a frontier staple for anyone with a rifle and a pot. The meat was lean, almost delicate compared to beef, but when cooked low and slow, it became tender enough to fall apart with a fork. Saloon rabbit stew started with browning the meat in pork fat or beef tallow, then building a base with onions, potatoes, carrots, and whatever root vegetables were available. Some cooks added wild herbs foraged from the plains, sage, thyme, or juniper. In the Southwest, especially New Mexico and Arizona, rabbit stew took on influences from Mexican and native cooking traditions, with cooks adding dried chilies, cumin, garlic, and sometimes even tomatoes if they were available. The result was hearty and warming, with a complexity you wouldn't expect from such humble ingredients. It wasn't food for show-offs or gamblers. Rabbit stew was for working cowboys who've been riding hard all week, tired of jerky and hardtack, and craving something that reminded them of Sunday dinners they hadn't seen in months. Served in deep bowls with crusty bread on the side, it offered comfort in a world that didn't hand out much of it. Chuckwagon coffee. Cowboys had names for it that ranged from affectionate to terrifying. Cowboy Coffee, 6-shooter brew, belly wash, and the classic strong enough to float a horseshoe. This wasn't the carefully measured, filtered coffee we drink today. This was survival fuel, brewed in battered tin pots over open flames using coarse ground beans, or sometimes beans that weren't ground at all, just crushed with a rock. The method was brutally simple. Boil water, throw in a handful of grounds, let it bubble, and then add something to settle the grounds to the bottom. Eggshells were common. Some cooks used a piece of dried fish skin. Others just poured carefully and accepted that you'd be chewing a few grounds with every sip. Saloons kept the pot going all day, rarely emptying it completely. They'd just add more grounds and water as needed, building layers of flavor or bitterness, depending on your perspective. What you got was jet black liquid that delivered caffeine like a punch to the jaw. Cowboys drank it before breakfast to wake up, after meals to aid digestion, and sometimes in place of sleep when night watch called. Saloons served it in tin cups, often for just a few cents or a pinch of gold dust. If the barkeep liked you, he might offer a splash of whiskey to correct the flavor. But most cowboys drank it straight, hot as they could stand it, because coffee wasn't about enjoyment. It was about endurance. Squirrel Fricassee. Yes, squirrel. And before you dismiss it as desperation food, understand this. In wooded regions from Missouri through Arkansas and into parts of Texas, squirrel was considered good eating, flavorful, abundant, and surprisingly versatile. Saloons in areas where forests met prairie often served squirrel fricassee, a dish borrowed from French and European settlers that involved pan-frying the meat first, then finishing it in a creamy gravy. The squirrel was cleaned and jointed, then lightly floured and fried until the skin crisped. After that, it went into a pot with pan drippings, flour, milk or water, and plenty of black pepper. Some cooks added wild onions or mushrooms. The whole thing simmered until the meat was tender and the gravy thick enough to coat a spoon. Served over biscuits, cornbread, or just eaten with a fork, it was rich, peppery, and satisfying in a way that only slow-cooked meat can be. Squirrel fricassee wasn't advertised on signs outside the saloon. It was a local's dish, something you heard about from the barkeep or a regular who knew the kitchen secrets. And if you grew up in squirrel country, one bite would take you straight back to childhood. Back when hunting small game with your father was how you learned to shoot, and every meal was a lesson in making the most of what the land provided. Fried calf brains. Nothing was wasted on the frontier, not even the brains. When a steer was butchered, every organ had value, and calf brains were considered a delicacy in saloons with the right clientele. Cleaned, sliced, battered in seasoned flour, and fried until golden and crispy, they offered a texture and flavor unlike anything else. Creamy inside, crunchy outside, with a mild taste somewhere between scrambled eggs and soft liver. Saloons in areas with strong German, French, or Mexican influence served them more openly. In those cultures, offal wasn't something to hide. It was good cooking, smart economics, and a sign of a skilled kitchen. Cowboys who grew up poor or in immigrant communities didn't flinch at the sight. They knew the rule. If it was fried, it was fair game. Some saloons even offered brain breakfasts, fried brains served with eggs, toast, and black coffee to start the day. Served with mustard, hot sauce, pickled onions, or just salt. Fried calf brains were surprisingly popular. They didn't taste shocking or strange. They tasted rich, satisfying, and, thanks to the frying, comforting. Today, the idea might turn stomachs. But back then, it was smart cooking and honest eating. Because the frontier didn't reward waste. It rewarded resourcefulness. Fried salt pork and beans. If there's one dish that defines frontier eating, it's this. Beans and salt pork weren't just common. They were the backbone of survival across the American West. Salt pork was preserved in heavy brine, packed in barrels, and could last through brutal summers and freezing winters without spoiling. It was fatty, heavily salted, and not particularly tender, but when you sliced it thick and fried it in its own rendered fat, something magical happened. The edges crisped up, the fat turned golden, and suddenly you had something that tasted like prosperity. The beans, usually pinto or navy, were soaked overnight if time allowed, then boiled for hours until soft. Saloons often cooked them in massive pots with onions, molasses, lard, and sometimes a splash of vinegar for brightness. When supplies ran short, it was just beans swimming in pork grease. And somehow that was enough. This combination fueled thousands of miles of cattle drives, mining camps, and railroad crews. Saloons kept beans on the stove around the clock because cowboys didn't work 9-to-5 schedules. A drover might stumble in at 3 in the morning, saddle sore and starving, and expect food. Beans and salt pork delivered every time. Cheap, filling, and honest. Serve it with a chunk of cornbread or sourdough to soak up the drippings, and you had a meal that could sustain a man through just about anything the West could throw at him. Corn Dodger Biscuits. When flour was scarce or yeast non-existent, cowboys made do with what they had: cornmeal, water, salt, and heat. Corn Dodgers were dense, hand-formed biscuits made by mixing coarse cornmeal with boiling water and a bit of fat, usually bacon drippings or pork grease, then shaping the dough into rough ovals or patties. They were fried in skillets, baked on hot rocks near campfires, or cooked directly on cast-iron griddles until crispy outside and firm inside. The texture was gritty, the flavor earthy and slightly smoky, especially when cooked over wood fires. They weren't delicate or refined. They were frontier pragmatic, food that could be made quickly, eaten immediately, or wrapped in cloth and carried in saddlebags for days without spoiling. Some cowboys even tucked them into bedrolls overnight, ready to reheat at dawn with the first fire. Saloons elevated corn dodgers by serving them with molasses, sorghum, or alongside bowls of beans and stew. They filled the role that bread rolls play in modern diners. Something to soak up gravy, stretch a meal, or just give your hand something to do while you waited for the main course. To the cowboy, though corn dodgers were more than side items. They were reminders of home, of making do, of turning almost nothing into something that kept you alive for one more day. Buffalo roast. Before cattle ranches dotted the plains, buffalo was king. Millions of plains bison roamed freely. And for a brief window in frontier history, buffalo meat was the premium protein served in saloons from Kansas to Montana. The meat was dark, lean, and intensely flavorful, closer to venison than beef, with a richness that came from animals that spent their lives grazing wild grasses. Saloons near hunting camps or railroad depots roasted large cuts over open flame pits or in cast iron ovens, basting them with animal fat, salt, and whatever herbs were available. The most prized cut was the hump roast, a thick slab of shoulder meat that, when cooked slowly, became incredibly tender. It was sliced thin and served with gravy, potatoes, or just eaten on its own with bread to soak up the juices. Buffalo roast wasn't cheap. In boomtowns during the height of buffalo hunting, it could cost more than beef, not because it was rare, but because demand was insane. Cowboys flush with cash from cattle drives, miners celebrating a good claim, or lawmen marking successful captures would order buffalo to celebrate. It was status food, a way of showing you'd made it, at least for the night. Tragically, the popularity of dishes like this contributed to the near extinction of American bison by the 1890s. But for a time, buffalo roast was the centerpiece of the frontier feast, wild, powerful, and deeply American in a way nothing else could match. Biscuits and molasses. Sometimes the best food is the simplest. For cowboys too tired to chew meat and too poor for eggs, biscuits and molasses offered sustenance and sweetness in equal measure. The biscuits were made from flour, lard, salt, and water or sour milk. No yeast, no sugar, no waiting for dough to rise. Mixed quickly and baked in Dutch ovens or cast iron skillets. They came out crispy on top and flaky inside, with a buttery richness from the lard. Molasses, thick, dark, and almost treacle-like, was drizzled or poured on top like frontier syrup. It wasn't just a treat, it was fuel. Molasses provided quick energy from natural sugars, and combined with the carbohydrates in the biscuits, it gave cowboys the burst they needed after long rides or before heading back out to the trail. Some saloons even served this combination as dessert, especially in areas where fresh fruit or pie ingredients were impossible to find. But the real reason biscuits and molasses endured goes deeper than nutrition. For many cowboys raised in the South, this dish was a taste of childhood, of mornings at a family table, of mothers and grandmothers who made do with what they had, of a time before the trail called them away. One bite could bring all of that back, even if just for a moment. And in the hard, lonely life of the frontier, those moments mattered more than gold. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. Let's be direct. These aren't oysters, and they don't come from the ocean. Prairie oysters are bull testicles, removed during castration and transformed into one of the most notorious and surprisingly popular foods of the Old West. After spring and fall roundups, when young bulls were castrated to make them easier to manage, ranch hands didn't throw away the organs. They cleaned them, sliced them thin, dredged them in seasoned flour, and dropped them into pots of bubbling tallow or lard. What emerged were crispy, golden nuggets with a texture somewhere between chicken gizzard and liver. Tender inside, crunchy outside, and mild enough that the real flavor came from whatever you dipped them in. Hot sauce, mustard, vinegar, or just salt. Saloons in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Texas serve them during branding season, often as part of community celebrations where ranchers, cowhands, and townsfolk gathered to mark another successful roundup. Eating prairie oysters wasn't just about taste, it was about belonging. Refusing a plate could mark you as an outsider, someone too soft for frontier life. Cowboys ate them with pride, gamblers ate them on dares, and saloon owners served them knowing they'd sell. Because in a world where nothing was wasted and toughness was currency, prairie oysters were both food and statement. You weren't just eating organ meat. You were proving you could handle whatever the West demanded. Pickled eggs. Walk into any saloon worth its salt in the 1870s or 1880s, and you'd see them. Large glass jars filled with pale, ghostly eggs floating in cloudy brine. They weren't decorations. They were cheap, portable protein for cowboys too broke or too busy to order a full plate. Pickled eggs were made in bulk. Hard-boiled eggs submerged in vinegar, salt, mustard seed, peppercorns, garlic, and sometimes beet juice for color or chili peppers for heat. After soaking for days, or even weeks, they became sour, salty, spicy bombs of flavor. No utensils required. You grabbed one from the jar, cracked it against the bar, peeled off the rubbery skin, and ate it in a few bites. Some saloons sold them for a nickel. Others gave them away with a beer or whiskey purchase, an Old West version of happy hour snacks. They paired surprisingly well with alcohol, cutting through the burn of cheap whiskey and providing just enough substance to keep a man from getting too drunk too fast. Today, pickled eggs might seem like a novelty or a dare. But in 1875, halfway between one town and the next, with dust in your throat and hunger gnawing at your ribs, they were as close to fast food as the frontier offered. And for a cowboy counting every coin, they were proof that you didn't need much to survive, just salt, vinegar, and the will to keep moving. Game jerky, venison, elk, antelope. Jerky wasn't just trail food. It was currency, survival, and bar snack all rolled into one. When hunters returned from the woods or plains with deer, elk, or antelope, they'd cure the meat using salt, smoke, and sun, often seasoning it with black pepper, crushed red pepper, sage, or juniper berries. The result was tough, chewy strips packed with concentrated flavor that didn't spoil, didn't need heat, and could be carried anywhere. Saloons purchased jerky from hunters, traded for it, or made their own in smokehouses out back. It was sold by the piece, served on plates with pickles or cheese, or given as a road snack to travelers heading out. Pairing perfectly with beer or whiskey, jerky became the original bar snack, long before pretzels or peanuts existed. But jerky was more than convenience. It was proof of skill. Making good jerky required knowing how to hunt, how to cure, how to balance salt and smoke so the meat lasted without turning rancid. Cowboys who carried their own jerky weren't just fed, they were self-reliant. And in the West, that kind of independence earned respect. Jerky wasn't just food. It was a symbol of survival, carried in every saddlebag and shared around every campfire from Texas to Montana. Hardtack and gravy. Hardtack earned every one of its nicknames: tooth breakers, molar chippers, sheet iron crackers. These were survival biscuits in the truest sense: flour, water, and salt baked until bone dry and harder than most woods. They could last for years without spoiling, which made them perfect for military campaigns, long sea voyages, and frontier supply wagons. But eating one straight? That required either desperation or teeth you were willing to sacrifice. Saloons knew the trick. Soak the hardtack in water or broth until it softened, then drown it in hot gravy. The gravy was usually made from salt pork drippings, flour, black pepper, and maybe some chopped onions or bacon bits if the cook was feeling generous. The hardtack absorbed the gravy like a sponge, transforming from inedible rock into something warm, filling, and, if you squinted, almost comforting. For cowboys fresh off the trail, hardtack and gravy was civilization. It was the difference between chewing on leather-dry rations and eating something that tasted like someone cared. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't pretty, but it was warm. And in a world defined by dust, danger, and distance, warmth in any form was worth more than gold. This dish tells the whole story of cowboy cuisine. Make do, don't waste, and never underestimate the power of a good pan of grease. Miner's pot pie. In mining boomtowns where saloons and offices stood side by side, cooks needed dishes that were filling, affordable, and easy to produce in large batches. Miner's pot pie fit all three. Unlike modern pot pies with their creamy fillings and flaky crusts, this was rough frontier cooking. Beef, rabbit, or squirrel stewed with onions, potatoes, carrots, and whatever root vegetables could be sourced. The stew was poured into a cast iron pan lined with thick pastry dough, or sometimes just topped with biscuit dough if flour was too precious for a full crust. Pies were baked in communal ovens behind saloons or next to blacksmith forges, filling the air with the smell of roasting meat and baking dough. They were sold by the slice or served in individual tin pans, often with a side of pickles or leftover beans. To miners who spent their days underground or cowboys who'd been riding for weeks, pot pie was a revelation. Hot, substantial, and made with enough care to feel like someone's kitchen back home. When you sat down in a rowdy saloon with a bubbling pot pie in front of you and a pint of beer in your hand, the chaos outside could wait. The fights, the dust, the danger, all of it faded. For those few minutes, you had something warm, something real, something that reminded you why you kept going. And in the Wild West, that was worth every penny. Pinto Beans Chili without tomatoes. Before canned tomatoes became common and before chili powder was sold in stores, cowboys made chili the old way, with pinto beans, chunks of beef, dried chilies, and little else. In fact, traditional Texas bowl of red didn't include tomatoes at all. The base was built around dried ancho or pasilla peppers, toasted and ground by hand, then mixed into beef that had been seared in tallow until deeply browned. Pinto beans were soaked overnight and added to the pot along with wild garlic, onions, and sometimes a splash of coffee for depth and bitterness. The entire mixture simmered for hours, sometimes all day, until the beans were creamy. The beef was fall-apart tender, and the broth had thickened into something that clung to your spoon. Some saloons kept it minimalist: beef, beans, heat. Others experimented with cumin, oregano, or even whiskey. This wasn't just a meal, it was a challenge. Some saloons advertised their chili as the bowl of red that bites back, daring cowboys to finish a full serving without reaching for water. It was served with hunks of sourdough or cornbread, or sometimes just eaten straight with a spoon. If you asked for a mild, the barkeep would laugh and slide the pot closer. Because real frontier chili wasn't about comfort. It was about fire, endurance, and proving you could handle whatever the West threw at you, even if it came in a bowl. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits became a Southern breakfast staple, Cornmeal mush fueled the frontier. This dish was as simple as cooking got. Cornmeal stirred slowly into water or milk over low heat until it thickened into a creamy porridge. Left to cool in a tin pan, it firmed into a sliceable loaf that could be cut into thick slabs and pan-fried until golden and crispy on both sides. Saloons served it two ways. The sweet version came with molasses or sorghum drizzled on top. Frontier syrup for men who needed quick energy. The savory version was drizzled with rendered beef tallow mixed with salt and cracked black pepper, turning humble cornmeal into something rich and satisfying. Some cooks even stirred in bits of fried bacon or onions for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush didn't pretend to be elegant. It was survival food, budget food, working man's food. But for railroad crews, cattle drivers, and miners who hadn't seen a proper kitchen in months, it offered warmth and weight when both were in short supply. It was pioneer polenta, made for boots-on-the-ground survival, served without apology or pretense. Just heat, cornmeal, and fat, the building blocks of frontier endurance. Wild turkey and dumplings. When cattle prices soared and buffalo herds thinned, saloons in forested regions turned to wild game, and few dishes earned as much love as turkey and dumplings. Made from wild turkeys hunted in the woods, not the domesticated birds we know today. This dish started with a long, slow simmer to break down the tough, gamey meat. Once tender, the turkey was shredded and returned to a rich broth seasoned with onions, garlic, herbs foraged from the land, and plenty of black pepper. The dumplings were the magic touch. Rough drops of flour dough stirred in near the end of cooking, puffing up like clouds as they absorbed the broth. Some cooks made them with just flour and water. Others added a bit of lard or bacon drippings for richness. Either way, they emerged soft, pillowy, and perfect for soaking up every drop of turkey-flavored broth. This wasn't fast food. It took time, skill, and patience, qualities in short supply on the frontier. But when made right, turkey and dumplings transported cowboys back to Sunday suppers, to family tables, to a world before the trail called them away. Some said it was the closest thing to home you could get without riding 100 miles. And in the right saloon, this meal could stop a poker game mid-hand just from the smell alone. Dried apple pie, fresh fruit in the West, was a luxury reserved for those living near orchards or close to railroad lines. But dried apples? Those traveled, transported in crates and barrels. Dried apples could survive months of wagon travel without spoiling. Saloon cooks rehydrated them by soaking them in water overnight, then cooked them down with sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes a splash of whiskey or brandy if they wanted to impress. The crust was basic frontier dough, flour, lard, water, and salt. No butter, no eggs, no fancy techniques. Rolled thick to withstand high-heat cast iron baking. These crusts were sturdy enough to travel, but tender enough to eat. Some pies were double-crusted, others left open-faced, depending on how much dough was available. They emerged from the oven dense, golden, and filled with sticky, sweet-tart apple filling that still carried a hint of smokiness from the wood-fired heat. These weren't delicate French pastries. They were built to last, made to travel, designed to feed. But one bite of that stewed apple center, tangy and sweet with just a touch of spice, could make a grown cowboy remember orchards he'd left behind, autumn harvests with family, and kitchens that smelled like cinnamon instead of gunpowder. A slice cost a few cents, but for some men, it was worth more than the whiskey they washed it down with. Cow tongue in brown gravy. Cow tongue might sound unusual today, but in Wild West saloons, it was considered a premium offering. More expensive than stew, more refined than beans, and reserved for customers willing to pay a bit extra. The tongue required time and skill to prepare properly, so only saloons with dedicated cooks and steady clientele served it regularly. The process started with boiling the tongue for hours with onions, bay leaves, and peppercorns until tender. Once cooked, the tough outer skin was peeled away, revealing silky, flavorful meat underneath. The tongue was then sliced thick, seared in a hot skillet to develop a crust, and smothered in rich brown gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and beef stock. Served with mashed potatoes, fried apples, or thick slices of cornbread, It was a meal that announced you weren't just another drifter. The texture was unlike anything else. Smooth, almost buttery, with a deep beefy flavor that regular cuts couldn't match. Seasoned cowboys, professional gamblers, town marshals, and successful businessmen ordered it. It wasn't food for people just passing through. It was food for people who'd earned their place at the bar. And if you managed to get the last serving on a busy night, you didn't share. You savored every bite. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes, also called journey cakes, hoe cakes, or just plain corn cakes, with a frontier's flatbread. Originally made by indigenous communities and quickly adopted by settlers, they became a cowboy staple from New England to New Mexico. Made from nothing more than cornmeal, boiling water, and a pinch of salt, the batter was dropped onto hot griddles and fried until the edges curled and the surface developed golden brown spots. Sometimes they were served with sorghum or molasses for sweetness, but more often than not, Johnny cake for plain. Used as edible plates under stew, beans, or gravy. They didn't crumble, didn't spoil quickly, and could be made by the dozen without fancy equipment or ingredients. Saloons loved them because they were fast, cheap, and universally accepted. Cowboys called them trail flapjacks or just hot and good, depending on the cook skill level. In many ways, Johnny cakes represented everything frontier cooking stood for. Simplicity, practicality, and the ability to turn the most basic ingredients into something that kept you alive. If a saloon's cook made good Johnny cakes, crispy outside, tender inside, with that perfect corn flavor, word spread. Cowboys would ride an extra mile just to eat at that particular establishment. Because good food, even simple food, was worth the detour. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Not every cowboy had a sweet tooth, but those who did found unexpected comfort in bread pudding, the frontier's ultimate waste-not dessert. Made from stale bread, old biscuits, or leftover cornbread that was too hard to eat on its own, bread pudding transformed scraps into something warm and satisfying. The bread was torn into chunks and soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, and sugar, then baked until golden and custardy. Some saloon cooks elevated it with raisins, dried apples, or a dusting of cinnamon. But the real magic came from the topping. A warm sauce made from whiskey, butter, and sugar, stirred over low heat until it thickened and poured over the pudding just before serving. The whiskey didn't cook out completely. It left behind a warm, boozy sweetness that turned simple bread pudding into something memorable. Bread pudding wasn't always on the menu. It appeared when there was leftover bread, when the cook had time, when someone in the kitchen cared enough to make something slow and thoughtful. For travelers who've been riding for days through dust and danger, bread pudding felt like kindness, a small gesture that said you mattered, even if just for the time it took to eat dessert. And in a world where kindness was rare, that single bowl could mean everything. Gooseberry Cobbler. Gooseberries grew wild across the plains and foothills, thriving in places where other fruits struggled. For saloon cooks who knew where to look, they were frontier gold, tart, tangy, and perfect for desserts that needed bold flavor to compete with heavy meals. Gooseberry Cobbler started with the berries cooked down with sugar into a jammy, sweet-sour filling that was poured into cast-iron pans. The topping was simple. Thick dollops of biscuit dough dropped on top of the fruit, creating an uneven, rustic surface that baked into golden peaks. Some saloons served it with fresh cream if they had access to a dairy. Others just dusted it with sugar and called it done. The flavor was assertive, nothing delicate or subtle about it. The gooseberries delivered a sharp tartness that cut through the sweetness, creating a balance that made you want another bite, even when you were full. Old-timers and cowboys who'd grown up foraging loved Gooseberry Cobbler because it tasted like the land itself, wild, untamed, and earned through knowledge passed down through generations. It wasn't store-bought or imported. It was gathered by hand, baked with care, and served warm. Each bite was a reminder that the frontier could be harsh, but it could also be generous if you knew where to look and what to do with what you found. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. In mountain towns and settlements built along rivers and streams, saloons had access to something most frontier establishments didn't: fresh fish. Trout caught that morning from cold mountain water was cleaned, gutted, and left whole. head, bones, and all. Then it was dredged in coarse ground cornmeal mixed with salt and black pepper, and fried in pork fat until the crust turned golden and crackly. Unlike beef or buffalo, trout didn't need hours of cooking. It was quick, delicate, and when prepared well, it offered a refined eating experience that felt almost elegant, even when served on a tin plate in a dusty saloon. The cornmeal crust provided texture and flavor, sealing in the fish's natural moisture while adding that signature frontier crunch. Served with pickled onions, boiled potatoes, or just a wedge of lemon if available, fried trout was a special occasion meal. For cowboys who spent weeks eating jerky, beans, and hardtack, fried trout was a revelation. It was light, fresh, and delicate in a way that frontier food rarely managed. And for travelers arriving from back east, accustomed to more refined dining, trout offered a taste of civilization in an otherwise wild landscape. When you cracked through that crispy cornmeal shell and tasted the tender, flaky fish inside, you remembered that the frontier wasn't just about survival. Sometimes it was about actually living. Scrapple. The final dish on our list came from the Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania Dutch communities, but found its way into Wild West saloons by the late 1800s as settlers moved westward, bringing their food traditions with them. Scrapple was the ultimate expression of frontier resourcefulness. Pork scraps, liver, heart, and other trimmings that didn't make into sausages or roasts, all boiled together until tender, then mixed with cornmeal and spices into a thick mush. This mixture was poured into loaf pans and left to cool and firm up overnight. The next morning, it was sliced thick and fried in a hot skillet until both sides developed a dark, crispy crust. Inside remained soft and savory, with a complex flavor that combined the richness of organ meat with the earthiness of cornmeal. The texture contrast, crunchy outside, creamy inside, made it surprisingly satisfying. Saloons served scrapple for breakfast, especially in colder months when hearty morning meals were essential. Cowboys topped it with molasses for sweetness, mustard for tang, or fried eggs for extra protein. Some ate it plain, savoring the pork flavor that came through despite the cornmeal base. Scrapple might have sounded strange to newcomers, but to anyone who understood frontier economics, it was brilliant. Take the parts nobody else wanted, transform them into something delicious, and waste absolutely nothing in the process. In a world where survival meant using every resource to its fullest, scrapple was more than food. It was philosophy served on a plate, a celebration of making do, thinking creatively, and finding value in places others overlooked. And wrapped in that crackling crust was a lesson the whole frontier understood. Nothing is worthless if you know what to do with it. So there you have it, 25 authentic dishes served in Wild West saloons, and every single one of them is real. These weren't just meals. They were survival strategies, cultural traditions, and sometimes acts of desperate creativity. Saloons weren't glamorous whiskey palaces filled with nothing but gunslingers and card games. They were the first truck stops, the original diners, the only places a cowboy could find hot food between dust storms, cattle drives, and the long, lonely road west. Some of these dishes were strange by today's standards. Some were surprisingly sophisticated, and some, like biscuits and molasses or fried trout, might make you wish you could walk into one of those old saloons right now and order a plate for yourself. The American frontier was built on more than courage and gunpowder. It was built on cast-iron skillets, sourdough starters carried in saddlebags, and cooks who could turn organ meat and cornmeal into something worth riding miles to taste. These 25 dishes tell that story, one plate, one bowl, one bite at a time. If this journey through Wild West cuisine made you hungry for more history, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another trip back in time. And here's the real question. Which of these 25 dishes would you actually try if you had the chance? And which one would you refuse, even if someone offered you gold just to take a bite? Drop your answers in the comments. We want to know where you draw the line between adventurous eating and absolutely not. Now saddle up, timekeepers, and click that next video because we're bringing back even more forgotten flavors from America's past.